Over these last days, we've been making an exploration into the nature of what is called anger. But perhaps if we dive a little deeper, we can now begin an exploration into the nature of what is called reality, or, put in another way, the way of perceptions. And the Sufis are great masters at representing these explanations in their stories. So this is a Sufi story about a man who we'll call again Hamid, who was a collector of thorns, brambles, those things that fed the tanurs, the outdoor ovens of the time. He made a subsistence living for himself and his wife, and they had enough to eat, but he was growing old now and tired. But one day, when he was out in the deep forest, collecting the bramble bushes to take to the market, suddenly he heard the trilling of a bird. And he looked up, and what he saw was, in the high branches, a bird of many colors in a golden cage, its eyes fixed on him, and the warbling of its song seemed to be directed at him. So he looked, and of course it was too high up in the trees for him to climb. So he thought to himself, "What is this bird telling me?" So he had a thought, and he immediately stopped collecting his brambles, and he took what he had to the market as was usual, and then he went home early. The day was still quite young, but he told his wife what had happened, and he said, "I am no longer going to be a thorn collector. God will provide for us." Well, his wife thought that he had had too much sun, he was a little bit deluded, and gave him a bowl of soup and put him to bed, thinking that the next morning he would be normal and get up and go about his daily business. But the next morning, when he got up, he said to his wife, "I am no longer a thorn collector. I am not going to the forest today. God will provide for us." So his wife really thought that he had lost his mind. What could she do? They had to put bread on the table. So she herself picked up the little digging instrument that her husband used. She took the bread and cheese and the flask that she had prepared for him, as she did every day, and she set out herself into the forest. And she did indeed find a little area where there were many thorn bushes, and she started to dig. But as she dug, all of a sudden she heard a clanging sound, and as she dug down a little further, she found a chest. And when enough soil was removed and she lifted the lid of this chest, to her very great surprise, inside there was gold. She took the gold in her hands and lifted it up and let it run through her fingers, and underneath the gold there were gems of inestimable worth. She was overjoyed. They had wealth beyond their imagination. But she couldn't move the chest. It was too heavy. So, covering it over carefully and putting some rocks on the top to mark the place, she hastened home to her husband to tell him what she had found. But when they went back to the place where the chest was buried and they removed the dirt, it was still too heavy for them to lift. What were they to do? So the thorn seller said to his wife, "There is no one in the village we can trust, but our neighbor, who has a little stall in the market, has a wagon and a donkey, and we've known him for many years to be a kind man. We can ask his help, and we can share the riches with him." So they went to their neighbor's house, and they solicited his aid, and they went back to the treasure chest. The storekeeper was overwhelmed by the wealth that was in the chest, but they labored together and placed the chest on the wagon, and the donkey pulled it back. But greed took over the heart of the storekeeper neighbor, and while they were on their way back, he said to them, "Oh, your house is too small for us to spread out the wealth. Let's bring the chest to my house." So the thorn keeper and his wife agreed. But when they got back to the storekeeper's house and had unloaded the chest, he said, "Oh, we're all too tired tonight. It's too late at night to divide the goods. Come back in the morning and we'll make that separation." Overnight, the storekeeper could not contain himself. He spent the night thinking how rich he was, that he could go and build a palace and have a harem, and so forth and so on. The next morning, when the thorn collector and his wife came to his house and knocked on the door, he said, "What treasure? What treasure are you talking about? Make believe. I have no recollection of any of this. You're having delusions. Delusions! There is no treasure." The thorn keeper and his wife were shattered and went back to their house, the wife dropping on the floor, sobbing in tears. There was no one they could turn to. No one in the village would believe them. But the old thorn collector said to his wife, "Wife, we've been poor all of our life, and if God wills that we remain poor, so it will be. But if it is God's will, then wealth will reign through our roof." Now, as it happened in those days, the roofs were flat, made of straw, thatch, but they always had a hole in the center, because they spread their herbs on the roof to dry and had a hole through which they could be passed. This hole was covered over with a stone to protect it from being rained on. But in the meantime, the storekeeper could not sleep. he was so overwhelmed with the thought of these riches that he got up in the middle of the night and went to the chest to gloat over its contents. But when he opened the lid, instead of being filled with gold and gems, it was filled with writhing vermin, snakes and scorpions and cockroaches and vermin of all kinds. Quickly shut the lid again, and he said, "Those two neighbors of mine have put a spell on me. I'll show them." Well, of course, a chest full of vermin is much lighter than a chest full of gold. So he was able to take the chest very easily over to his neighbor's house and climb on the roof. And through the hole in the roof, he began to empty the vermin. But as they passed through the thatched roof, they became gold coins and began to rain down on the thorn collector and his wife. But, of course, the storekeeper, seeing this, was saying, "What has happened? What is happening to me?" And he closed the chest and took it back. But again, when he opened it up, all there was vermin, vipers. And so back to the thorn collector's house he went to empty the remainder of the contents down in the hole in the roof. And he did. And of course, each time they became gold coins and gems, until there was but one gold coin left in the bottom of the chest. But perceived by the storekeeper, it was a venomous cobra. So he said, "I'll finish these people off." So he put the cobra in a bag and tossed it through the hole in the roof. When it landed, the old woman opened up the bag, and inside there was a string of pearls of great, great worth. The storekeeper went back to his house, and for the remainder of his days he remained what he had always been, just a storekeeper. But the thorn collector and his wife, taking their vast wealth, built themselves a house and shared all that they had received with those in need. They lived long and happy lives. What is it that rises up in you as an understanding of the meaning of this story relative to an exploration into the nature of reality, or the way of perceptions? What is your take from your experience on the meaning of this story? The nature of reality. Is it synonymous with perception? So we have that little, sorry, dear. Right. Right. Yes. Right on. Right on. Yes. There's that story about the farmer who lost his shovel. You remember that story? He lost his shovel. And that evening he saw the son of his neighbor walking past the gate, and he said, "Look at that shifty fellow. I bet he stole my shovel. Look at him. He looks like a thief. Look, he's always got that shifty look about him." And the next day he went down and found his shovel in the ditch where he'd left it. The next night when his neighbor's son walked by, said, "Oh, what a fine looking fellow that is. He's an upstanding young lad."